The eyes are supposed to see everything. That is the illusion Gilead depends on. Fear only works when people believe they are constantly being watched, constantly monitored, constantly trapped. Which is exactly why Daisy, surviving underneath the eyes, may secretly be one of the most important hidden details inside the Testaments. Because the terrifying truth is this: Daisy did not defeat Gilead through strength. She defeated it by learning how to disappear inside the system itself. And honestly, that may expose Gilead's biggest weakness better than anything else in the series. Because when you really analyze Daisy's journey carefully, the clues suggest she was never just surviving. She was unknowingly proving that Gilead's control was already beginning to fail from the inside. Before we break down how Daisy outsmarted the eyes, we need to understand why she entered Gilead in the first place. Because Daisy was never supposed to become part of that world. For most of her life, Daisy lived in Canada, far away from the nightmare of Gilead. She believed she was just an ordinary teenager living an ordinary life. But underneath that normal existence was a secret powerful enough to destabilize the regime itself. After the death of her adoptive parents, Daisy became connected to Mayday, the resistance network secretly working against Gilead from the shadows. And eventually, she was given a mission that sounded almost impossible. Enter Gilead. Carry information dangerous enough to expose the regime from within, and somehow survive long enough to complete the mission. That changes the entire way we should look at Daisy's story. Because once she enters Gilead, survival is no longer her only goal. She becomes an infiltrator inside one of the most oppressive surveillance states imaginable. And if the eyes ever discovered who she truly was, she would not simply disappear, she would become propaganda. A public example, a symbol Gilead could weaponize politically. And yet somehow, Daisy survives underneath the regime's nose far longer than she realistically should. That is where the real mystery begins. The eyes were never truly omniscient. One of the smartest hidden details inside the Testaments is that the eyes are not actually all-seeing. They only want people to believe they are. That illusion is what keeps Gilead psychologically powerful. Because once people believe resistance is impossible, most resistance dies before it even begins. But authoritarian systems always contain blind spots. And Gilead's biggest blind spot is predictability. The eyes are trained to look for obvious threats, violent rebellion, political conspiracies, organized resistance. They expect danger to look dramatic, visible, aggressive. But Daisy survives because she does not behave like the kind of threat Gilead expects. She adapts quietly. She observes. She listens more than she speaks. And slowly, she begins understanding something terrifying about Gilead itself. The system is far more fragile than it appears. Daisy learned the most important rule of survival. The moment Daisy enters Gilead, she realizes survival is psychological before it is physical. Every conversation becomes dangerous. Every reaction matters. Even eye contact can expose fear. At first, Daisy struggles emotionally because she still thinks like somebody from the outside world. She still expects honesty to matter. She still reacts openly to cruelty. But Gilead changes people quickly. Inside authoritarian systems, survival often depends on performance. People hide their real thoughts. They pretend constantly. They learn how to appear obedient while protecting parts of themselves internally. And Daisy adapts to that reality surprisingly fast. That becomes her greatest strength, not violence, not power, psychological flexibility. Because instead of openly fighting the system, Daisy learns how to move underneath the tension itself. And honestly, that makes her far more dangerous than an obvious rebel ever could be. Gilead underestimated Daisy completely. This is where the eyes make their biggest mistake. They underestimate her. Because Gilead's structure depends heavily on assumptions, young women are expected to obey, to remain passive, to follow instructions. That expectation creates dangerous blind spots. The regime never fully imagines somebody like Daisy quietly studying the system while emotionally adapting to it at the same time. And that allows her to survive. Because authoritarian governments often become obsessed with visible enemies while ignoring quieter forms of resistance. But Daisy represents a different kind of threat entirely. She learns, she observes contradictions, she notices fear inside powerful people. And slowly she realizes something shocking. Even the people running Gilead, no longer fully trust the system themselves. Daisy begins seeing the cracks inside Gilead. Before entering Gilead, the regime seems almost unstoppable from the outside. Perfectly organized, perfectly controlled, perfectly terrifying. But once Daisy lives inside it, she starts seeing the truth. The commanders lie constantly. The laws are filled with hypocrisy. Fear controls everyone, including the people in power. And perhaps most importantly, nobody fully trusts anybody anymore. That realization changes everything psychologically. Because once a dictatorship begins relying entirely on fear instead of belief, collapse quietly begins underneath the surface. And Daisy slowly starts recognizing that Gilead is already rotting internally. The eyes are overwhelmed by paranoia. People perform loyalty instead of genuinely feeling it. The commanders secretly break their own laws. And younger generations increasingly question the system emotionally. That instability creates gaps. And Daisy learns how to move through those gaps carefully. Aunt Lydia secretly understands the truth. This is also why Aunt Lydia becomes such an important part of Daisy's story. Because Lydia understands Gilead better than almost anyone else. She sees the corruption, the hypocrisy, the emotional decay spreading underneath the regime's religious image. And most importantly, Lydia understands something the commanders ignore. Information is more dangerous than violence. That may explain why Daisy survives situations that should have exposed her much earlier. Because Lydia increasingly acts less like somebody protecting Gilead's future, and more like somebody preparing for Gilead's collapse. That does not suddenly make Lydia a hero. But it does make her strategic. Because intelligent people inside collapsing systems often begin planning beyond the regime itself. And Lydia may already realize Daisy represents something incredibly dangerous to Gilead. Proof that younger generations can still psychologically resist indoctrination. Daisy's humanity becomes her greatest weapon. Ironically, the very thing Gilead constantly tries destroying in people becomes Daisy's greatest strength. Her humanity. Because Daisy still feels empathy, curiosity, connection. She still sees people as individuals instead of roles. That emotional awareness helps her understand the system in ways authoritarian governments struggle to predict. Because Gilead sees people as categories: handmaids, wives, Marthas, ants, functions instead of human beings. But Daisy continues seeing the fear underneath people's performances, and that allows her to navigate Gilead more intelligently than brute resistance ever could. Because survival inside oppressive systems often depends on understanding human weakness. And Daisy becomes surprisingly good at recognizing fear, loneliness, and doubt inside the very people helping sustain the regime. The terrifying truth Daisy discovers: by the time Daisy fully understands Gilead, she also realizes something horrifying. The regime is no longer surviving because everybody believes in it. It is surviving because everybody is afraid of what happens if they stop pretending. That is a massive difference. Because systems built entirely on fear eventually begin collapsing once enough people emotionally disconnect from the ideology itself. And honestly, that process may already be happening everywhere inside Gilead. The commanders no longer fully believe in their own morality. The younger generation increasingly notices contradictions. Women understand the emotional damage of the system more clearly than anyone else. And Daisy becomes living proof that even somebody trapped inside Gilead can still psychologically resist becoming part of it completely. That possibility alone makes her dangerous. At first glance, Daisy surviving underneath the eyes seems almost impossible. Gilead's surveillance system appears overwhelming, unavoidable, all-seeing. But hidden throughout the testaments are clues suggesting the eyes were never truly as powerful as they wanted people to believe. Because authoritarian systems rely heavily on predictability, and Daisy became unpredictable. She learned how to adapt emotionally, socially, psychologically. She understood how to move quietly underneath attention instead of confronting power directly. And most importantly, she never fully allowed Gilead to control her identity internally. That may ultimately be why she survived. Not because she physically defeated the system, but because she understood the system's blind spots before the system understood hers. And honestly, that may become the exact reason Gilead eventually collapses altogether.